when we face the shadow self and give it a name can the healing begin. And that phrase had rattled around my head when I was up in Copenhagen, and it was when I was on stage with George Monbiot, and we were waiting for Evo Morales and various other leaders to come down, and they got delayed and whatever, that someone stood up in the audience and said, you know, we need a new name, a new language to deal with this mass damage and destruction to the earth. And I found myself thinking, you know, you're right, it's like genocide, only it's ecocide. That should be a crime. And that was the beginning of my quest, my mission, if you like, to bring ecocide crime into being. And it was that same kind of light bulb moment when I heard about solastalgia. This is a very important term, not just within the legal context and the psychological context, but actually I think it is about healing. We begin to heal that collective trauma when we're able to identify it for what it is and give it proper name. So I'd love you to give a fantastic round of applause for this remarkable man, Bill Albrecht.
Thank you very much. I'll try and live up to half of that introduction. I'm a retired philosopher. My last job was Professor of Sustainability at Murdoch University in Perth. I'm a transdisciplinary thinker. I call myself a farmosopher now because I combine gardening and small-scale farming with thinking. That seems to... I'm hoping there are lots of farmosophers in the audience tonight. So I retired from academia mainly because I felt that my transdisciplinary and feral inclinations were no longer welcome within the evolution of the modern corporate university. I was being told to do things with publications in particular journals and to do certain types of grant applications which were against my nature. So my retirement was actually to work, but to work in a place, Wallaby Farm, which is 3 hours north of Sydney, a place where I could actually work as a free thinker, just to have time to think about the things that I felt were incredibly important. And of course, my thinking intersects with the whole world now, with people like Polly and others who are doing fantastic and important work trying to help us navigate our way out of the mess, which I just accept that the Anthropocene is a good term to describe the mess that we're currently in. Part of my creative work is, conceptual creation. I call myself a conceptual artist, but some people in Australia call me a bullshit artist. But I've tried to get away from that joking about it, and I think I've now come to the maturity in my thinking that this path that I'm on seems to be striking a chord with many people worldwide, and that as a result it's wonderful to come to a place like Hookwood, where I think a community of people with shared interests is already here. So I hope what I'm going to do tonight is give you an insight into an area that perhaps you haven't thought about before. The terms, I'm going to give you an exam at the end, so you better actually pay attention. Some of the charts that I'll be putting up will have at least 40 or 50 different new concepts that have yet to go into the dictionary, so you have to remember them. So the talk is the psychoterratic. Well, there's a term that some of you have never heard of, right from the title. Well, Psycho was a really disturbing film, but it actually just means the psyche, and terratic means of the earth. So a psychoterratic state is one where your mental state is being influenced or affected by the state of the earth. Solastalgia I'll say more about in a minute, because Polly's already introduced the basic idea about what it is, and I'll give you some more descriptive analysis of it using examples of the upper hunter, much like the Bulga case study that was referred to in the court case. And we don't tend to think about things like fire and smoke as emotional or sources of emotional insight, but I think they are, and I hope that I can convince you of this by the end of this talk. Being Australian, I can't think about psychoterratic things without first thinking about the Aboriginal people of Australia. The latest research suggests that they've been on the Australian mainland between 65 million and 65,000 and 80,000 years. Sorry about the million. the time that they've been there has enabled them to accumulate knowledge about how to live on a fire-prone landscape. So Australia's been drying out for the last tens of thousands of years. It's dominated by eucalypts. Eucalypts burn, some people call them a pyrophilic type of plant. It actually thrives under fire. So the more you burn it, the more it comes back. For humans to live in a landscape that's becoming more and more fire-prone, they had to develop quite precise techniques about how to burn the country to use fire to stop dangerous wildfire occurring. And so I had the great privilege and pleasure of being in Arnhem Land at the top end of Australia over a 3-year period where I was studying the ethics of feral buffalo hunting, believe it or not. As an applied ethicist, you get to do some pretty amazing things in life. But while I was there doing my work as an ethicist, I was being taught by the traditional owners about fire stick farming, which is a term created in the 1970s to describe the mosaic of pattern burning that Aboriginal people conduct to reduce the impact of wildfire. And they also use this burning to create the habitat that's needed for wallabies and kangaroos and small marsupials that then come in and eat the green pick, the new grass that comes up after fire. And it has an ecological function as well as a human safety one. They also burnt to create roads. They, like many other humans, don't like poisonous snakes, so it was always a good chance to get rid of some snakes if you wanted to. So there were, and fire was used for cooking and signalling and a whole lot of other things. But there's not a talk about Aboriginal fire stick farming, although I'd love to say more about it. This man influenced my thinking on fire stick farming and fire with just one. His name is Big Bill Nye, Gagaju Man, a book that I bought at the Krakatoa National Park in the Northern Territory. And his wisdom as an Aboriginal elder was being passed on to the next generation. But this is what he had to say about fire. He says, "This earth I never damage, I look after. Fire is nothing, just clean up. When you burn, new grass coming up." There's a man representing 65,000 to 80,000 years of wisdom telling us that fire is nothing. And it just arrested me, and I thought, well, you know, how could fire be nothing in a landscape now in Australia where in Victoria, a few years ago, we had a fire that killed 170 odd people, tens of thousands of sheep, cattle, and other animals, and wiped out hundreds of houses. So fire is nothing. So the idea that fire is an asset and that it's part of your culture and that it's contributing to ecological diversity is something you have to come to grips with first and foremost in the Australian context. And it's probably the case in most other traditional indigenous environments and cultures throughout the world. And so this idea that fire is connected to culture and fire has within it an important component of human emotion, human culture, human education. That's part of my thinking that now we need to think about fire. Actually, I'll just zip to that one for a second. That fire delivers positive psychoterratic emotions. I don't know about you, but I love fires. I like lighting them. I like looking at them. I like what they do to wood, even though I love wood as well. And I feel that fire is like a primordial psychoterratic emotion built into us. It's something which burns us if we're not careful, but if you can control it and come to be able to use it with safety, then it's a positive human emotion connected to this primordial element. And what's more, in most cases, you can have this enjoyment with fire for free. You don't need to buy an expensive Xbox or something, or a really expensive projector. The real thing is actually totally good. So where are these positive psychoterratic states? It occurred to me that there are lots of them, but we don't really name them in language because they were once given to us for free. We could freely go to a beach or a forest and as human beings take in an experience that didn't require a complex set of conscious thoughts to actually enjoy the moment. E.O. Wilson even wrote in his great book on biophilia that people often go to the sea and would take a walk for reasons that they cannot put into words. Well, I think it's important that we put into words these positive psychoterratic emotions that we have, mainly for the reason, and this is my connection to Polly's work, is that we can no longer take for granted the circumstances under which we were delivered these free, wonderful, positive emotional experiences in contact with the earth. And so people like Wilson, Eric Fromm earlier discussed biophilia, the geographer Tuan with his concept of topophilia or love of place. That's also been an important concept in these positive psychoterratic terms. And there's a whole bunch there that got the name Albrecht attached to them. So they're the ones that I'll be quizzing you on later. Polly mentioned solophilia, which is the love of working with other people to save places that are under threat or are being damaged. Eutieria, I'll explain in a minute, and endomophilia, I'll explain in a minute. I'll put a new one in there called terraleben, which roughly translated should mean something like, let the earth live. And it's the opposite of ecocide. If we're going to confront people who are destroying the earth, we're going to have to be strong enough to have a really strong concept that enables us to say, you guys, or girls, whatever, we're not going to allow this to happen. And we need a strong word, a strong response to the damage that's being done by, I don't know what we would call them. Back in the old days, they'd be goths and vandals, but I can only think of expletives deleted. All right. So, Eutieria, I created that because there wasn't a word for a good earth feeling that I could find in the dictionary other than I was having my dinner tonight with people from Byron Bay, which is a great surfing place in Australia. The surfers talk about that oceanic feeling. People in religious circumstances use that phrase, and so do Freudians. It's this merging of the subject and the object where you no longer have this sense of being separate and distinct. Your ego is lost in a wider subject that you are merging into. So I decided, I'm not a swimming, surfing type guy, I'm a tree hugger. So I wanted a good earth feeling, so I just created one. I actually had a simpler version, which was Eutieria, and then I looked that up to see if it had been created before, and it was the website of a porn star. So you have to be careful with these words. So I very quickly put the Spanish tierra in order to make sure that I didn't have to look at the website of a rather amazing porn star. So that's back to the staring into the fire as something deeply satisfying. Birdwatching does it for me. I'm not a twitcher, but I get lost with the birds, and I'll be away for hours, and all of a sudden I'll become conscious again that I've been in a state which has been totally immersed in an environment that I wanted to be in, as opposed to one that you study scientifically as some kind of an objective observer. I think the patch burning of Aboriginal people also creates endomophilia in Australia, and probably there are other ways that you can get your endomophilia, but the love of the locally endemic, the demos of the people, that which is unique to the place where you live, can't be replicated anywhere else. In Australia, huge high levels of endemism in plants and animals. So you can't even go 100 metres without finding a different species that looks the same as the one that's just right next to it 50 metres down the track. So I think endomophilia is something that we all have within us, but we never had a word to describe it in English. Other cultures may have such words, but I'm an English speaker, so I'm sticking to this one. So we now go to the contemporary context, which is in Australia. We've had to create a new category of fire risk. So we did have a really nice, colour-coded one up to extreme. Now you'd think extreme would be enough to actually convey the message that fire is dangerous, and that if you are in a fire or there's a fire approaching, you've got to be alert and active, as I think the way they say it. But now we've put catastrophic onto the end of it. And that means that you can't fight this fire. If it's declared catastrophic, you have to leave. And that includes firefighters. They cannot legally fight a catastrophic fire because by definition they'll be immolated, and the catastrophe it will be fulfilled, as it were. So we've gone from a fire-controlled and fire-managed landscape over the 80,000 years to one over the last few decades, which has become out of control, literally wildfire. And we're now seeing changes in Australia that are also remarkable. Winter fires. Where I live, it's pretty wet and cold in the winter time. We even get frozen bird baths. So it's not as if the countryside is somehow hot all year round. Although it's spring right now, and I think today it's 35 degrees at Wallaby Farm, so it is getting hot all year round. But this burning in the winter is something that historically has never happened in Australia. So our fire season now is almost the whole year. And so we can't rely on bringing in firefighting equipment from California to help us during our summer, because they're now getting fire all year round as well. So everyone's panicking about the equipment and the firefighters needed. But then if it's declared catastrophic, well, nobody can fight them anyway. So the story is now all over the world, catastrophic fire, loss of life, loss of property. And it's not just the bush in Australia that's burning. This fire came into the centre of Canberra, the capital city of Australia, killed a number of people, took out over 500 houses, and caused terrible damage. To bring it home, this summer in Greece, we saw people running into the ocean in order to escape from a catastrophic fire. So the fear of fire has now returned into the world as a negative psychoterratic emotion. We can't gaze into the fire and have that nice eutieria experience. It's now a terrifying experience, and one that is now moving into the negative psychoterratic. So I took off about 30 additions I put to this in order to present this to you tonight. But it started with someone, in my estimation, a German Dr. Hoffer, who created the concept of nostalgia. And that concept is not the sickly sweet feeling about where you would like to be in a time past. The era of Elvis Presley or something like that might appeal to you, and you wish that somehow the world had never changed since then. Personally, I'm quite pleased that it has. But anyway, that's another matter. But the nostalgia that he spoke of was of a homesickness that could kill you. If you went away from home and you wished to return, and you were, say, a soldier fighting on a foreign shore, your nostalgia was both a psychological and a physical trauma that was powerful enough to kill you. So he thought it was a condition, a melancholia, so powerful that it could do you in. Since then, we've got people like, again, Wilson with the opposite of biophilia, the biophobia. I created Solastalgia in 2003. There's others that I've created that I'll say a little bit about later. Richard Lewis talks about nature deficit disorder. There are people like Bill Nye, whose concept of eco-paralysis is really important. Tierratrauma I created because I needed something other than solastalgia when dealing with issues like fire. Solastalgia is more a chronic condition, slow change leading to a deep emotional distress. Tierratrauma is the trauma of the here and now. It's right in your face, the oil rigs blowing up. So there is a need for us to start adding more and more to the negative psychoterratic typology, or the negative psychoterratic states. And I've even added to ecocide because I think ecocide and ecology is one of the areas that we're going to have to critique as we go into yet more larger scale damage and destruction. So an attack on the whole Earth is ecocide plus on steroids. Symbiocide, I'll explain that later, but I'll just leave it for the moment because I think I'll overwhelm you. So, eco-anxiety came from a journalist writing about pollution on the east coast of America in the 1990s, and then has now entered into academic discourse. It's a generalised feeling of anxiety and uncertainty about the state of your environment, and the feeling that it's not going to do you any good, that in fact your safety and your needs are not going to be met in the environment that you're living in. So again, the fire theme is there. Where there's smoke, there's fire. I've added meteor anxiety to that because now that we've all got smartphones and there are weather channels, we can know what's happening to the weather well in advance, and warnings about what's about to happen next are being repeated by the mass media. You're being told that there's a storm brewing in the Atlantic that will come and smash you in 3 days' time. And of course, that's going to worry people. Well, we didn't have a name for that, so I've called it meteor anxiety. I also felt it personally, and that's one of the other things that I'll say about solastalgia, is that call me deep and sensitive if you like, but on a 47-degree day at Wallaby Farm, I felt it was so hot that the eucalyptus forest was beginning to just exude volatile organic compounds. Eucalyptus oil is explosive. And I thought at that moment that it would only take a tiny spark somewhere and the whole landscape would just blow up. It was like living in, close to a petrol station and someone's just dropped the hose and there's petrol going everywhere and you can smell it. So that was a disturbing feeling. So disturbing. I thought, I can't understand how we could continue to live in this kind of heat. I mean, 47 is right at the limit of what humans can tolerate. And there were birds dying in the air and then hitting the ground on that day. And that's not unusual. As soon as you get over 45, there are some creatures that can't live. So meteor anxiety is actually quite a serious form of anxiety to have, because a bit like the lightning story, people do get hit by lightning. Their anxiety goes into deep trauma. Eco-paralysis, again, it's this idea that we don't do anything. And it's not because we're lazy or because we're criminally negligent or that we're selfish bastards. It's because the complexity involved in doing something is so deep that we can't make a definitive decision to do any one thing. And so you do nothing out of confusion, not out of neglect or spite or any kind of apathy. So solastalgia, the image why I wanted to use the slides is that's the Hunter Valley under open cut coal mining, and there's 500 square kilometres of mining like that. That's very close to the town of Bulga that Polly mentioned as part of the court case with solastalgia. So I work pro bono as a expert witness for the village to try and fight their response to this kind of environmental distress. So the relationship between a distressed environment and distressed people is what I do in my work, and that's what I'm trying to develop further. So the definition of solastalgia is this lived experience of negatively perceived environmental change. And it doesn't matter whether it's coal mining, gas fracking, airport noise, intensive chicken sheds, the local quarry, whatever it is that's happening in your environment that you find is being negatively perceived by you is a loss of something which you find valuable. Your love of place, or sometimes described as your sense of place. It's also connected to the sense that it's coming into your life and overwhelming you. You're feeling powerless to prevent it. So power and power relationships are an important part of this. And I did create a bumper sticker version of solastalgia, which is this one at the bottom. It's the homesickness you have when you're still at home. So you're at home and your home environment in effect is moving away from you. The nostalgia was where you moved away from home and wanted to come back. And so it's similar, it's melancholia, it's distressing. I don't ever claim that solastalgia is biomedically or a psychiatric issue that can be diagnosed. I published my first essay on this topic in a journal called Philosophy, Activism and Nature. So that gives you a clue as to what kind of a person I am and what kind of publication I wanted to put this concept into. If I had to put it into brain lesions and in psychiatry, I would have been a very different kind of person, I think. The open cuts. They call these open cuts. This one is about 1.5 kilometres long, half a kilometre wide, and almost half a kilometre deep. And I can't actually, unless maybe I can use this little creature here. It's a mouse. It doesn't actually show up on there. Up the top, there's a white blob in the mine. That's one of the world's largest machines. It's called a dragline or electric shovel. And in a single scoop, it takes out about a chunk the size of this room, of the earth, and then dumps it into a truck that's roughly got a bucket the size of this room. So bucket by bucket, truckload by truckload, that hole is being dug to get the black stuff at the bottom, which is the coal. So they blow up the soil, they put these spoil mountains of everything they dig out, and then this mine is still proceeding. It's still growing. This photo was taken in 2008. It's now ginormous. And right next door to it was a world-class vineyard that won world's best Chardonnay one year for its produce. Well, it's also the green fields in the background are horse studs, vineyards, cattle grazing. It used to be a big dairying area. And I interviewed people to find out whether or not my perception that this landscape was damaging people had any kind of veracity. And one of the women said, look, we're left with nothing but the final void, a deeply emotional response to what's going on. An Aboriginal man I interviewed said that he can't look at it, so he drives hundreds of unnecessary kilometres so that he can't see the landscape that's being desolated. So he says it makes you wild. And when I interviewed him, you have to look someone in the eye when they're telling you it makes you wild. He was so insulted and outraged by it, he couldn't really express himself beyond that. And you can see, they call them fugitive emissions. The methane is leaking out of this mine. The coal is exposed to the air and is oxygenating. The whole thing is a toxic mess. So, solastalgia and fire. I don't actually study solastalgia and fire until this trip because the Swedes were so traumatised by their forest burning for the first time. These are landscape architects and social scientists who wanted to know how does solastalgia relate to the response of Swedes that are really deeply distressed about their landscapes. So I've been looking at Australia and fire. We're now getting fires that are burning in our alpine areas as well. And I was trying to see if the alpine landscapes had any kind of connection to what's happening in the northern boreal forests of the Arctic Circle. Our alpine areas can't grow back. They have no geological or human history of fire. They've never burnt. So once they've gone forever. So Tasmania burnt last summer and it's now regularly burning on the high alpine areas. The eucalypt forests, they still come back, so you can be burnt out and within 5 to 10 years you'll have a forest back. But that's not the case with the alpine areas. So solastalgia relates with respect to fire for me in the long term after a fire, when people come back to a damaged area and are trying to figure out how to live within an environment that looks virtually nothing like the one they left. And then little bits and pieces come back, but it's never going to be the same landscape. It'll be a different one. Some aspects of it they might find joyous and surprising as things come back, but by and large, it's a pretty negative experience for them. The same for traditional people in the northern hemisphere in the Arctic Circle. The Sami in Sweden, they're now having to deal with the aftermath of wildfire through landscapes that once supported their reindeer during their winter. And now, without the winterland, the reindeer can't survive. So here's another case of a solastalgic landscape. Smoke. We don't often think about smoke as a psychoterratic thing. We don't tend to think about smoke at all, except that it kind of bothers us and gets in our eyes. But now we've got these huge fires that put smoke internationally, and we need new concepts to try and appreciate what it is that's going on when smoke is doing this to us. It's happened before, because when Krakatoa blew up in the 1880s, Munch painted this eco-apocalyptic vision based on the sunsets that were happening all over the world because of the volcanic dust that had been ejected into the atmosphere. So he wrote that he felt as if a giant scream had gone through the whole earth. And in fact it had. Krakatoa, when it blew up, was felt all over the southern hemisphere, and the aftermath of the cloud was seen all over the world, including in the north of the northern hemisphere. So luckily there are other people that think about the psychoterratic, and a friend of mine in Wales came up with this idea of nebulous cloud, which is a blood cloud or haze. And the reason why she gave it that name was not just because of the colour, it's because what you're dealing with is the life somewhere else being converted through fire into a pall of smoke. She wrote again that forest fire smoke is different. Forest fire smoke is the carbon atoms of the recently dead, like the carbon atoms which rise from the crematorium chimney. Forest fires fanned by the Hurricane Ophelia killed 40 people or more and countless wildlife in Portugal and Spain, including hundreds of thousands of sentient trees. Well, that's a different take on smoke, isn't it? To have the sensibility and the emotional clarity to see that these events now, when forest fire smoke is coming all the way from Portugal and is creating these blood red skies in Wales. I took that photo a week ago in Sweden, where these, again, apocalyptic landscapes. So hot were these fires that the soil got burnt. So now there's rocks that weren't present in the landscape before. There were trees on top of them. And so it's a radically different landscape. I put mort smoke there because smoke is a nice Dutch word for smoke. And death smoke is a term that has to enter our language. But I haven't thought of a decent name for it as yet. Ginny Batson's name for the cloud, I think, is perfect, but it's work in progress, unfortunately. So beyond solastalgia, we've got lots of work to do. In a deteriorating world, and I hope that that's not a controversial statement, the work is urgent. But as Polly said, with respect to solastalgia, defining the negative also sharpens our mind on the positive. You know, I'm thinking we've got to move through a sequence of steps here, the eco side, the tierra side, the symbiote side. The symbiote side is the interconnected life on the whole of the earth. Maybe some people would call it Gaia, but it's the idea that the symbios is the root word for symbiosis. It means living together. The whole structure of living together, you know, everyone says you pull on the thread of life and it's connected to everything else. So there's a range of concepts here that I'm working on, but the tierratrauma is the idea that we've got to defeat them. I've been working on the concept of the Symbiote Scene, which is the solution to all of the problems of the Anthropocene. The Symbiote Scene is an ideal construction, if you like, where all of the positive earth emotions that are now being named, that we had for free in the past, are going to be in evidence again, because we're going to create the kind of structures, the kind of lifestyles, the way we use technologies, how those technologies are built. It's a long story. that I've told in a book which I will have coming out next year. But the idea of the Symbiote Scene is that every single artefact that we currently produce via toxic, non-recyclable, non-life affirming means will have to be replaced with what I call a symbiofact, which is the symbiotic version of the same thing. If we can't do it, well then we can't have it. With 8 million people on the earth, we don't have any choice, because every single thing we do is going to be amplified through the system. It's at such scale that we can't afford to live in the Anthropocene and its toxic mess any longer. So I've written Earth Emotions. Its subtitle is New Words for a New World. The new world is being shaped by the Anthropocene and its leaders, if we can call them that, right now. And I don't see much of a future for that evolutionary path for humans. So the new world that I would like to see for my granddaughter and children is the Symbiote Scene. It's an intensely positive, ridiculously optimistic view of the future, where positive earth emotions will triumph over the negative, where somebody in the Oxford Concise Dictionary, the E version, gets rid of the word solastalgia in the year 2100 because it's become redundant. There's nobody experiencing it any longer. Then, you know, I'll be well composted by then, but I will turn over gently and think, that was a good job. I created something that had to be got rid of. So it's a bit like, getting rid of stomach poisoning or something. And the artwork for this, a wonderful American artist by the name of Kate McDowell produced this piece, which she named Solastalgia in 2012 or 13, I think, in a piece that was written in the New York Times about, in part, about me and my work. And she has a koala sitting in the middle of that skull. Well, I have koalas on Wallaby Farm. I can't deliver them every day because they're ornery buggers. You know, you'll see them one day and then they won't be around for another week or two. But I do think I have a koala in my head. And this work that I do is not just because I'm worried about the psychoterratic and what its impact is on humans. It also is directed at non-human beings and the world that they are trying to live in at the same time as we are. So I think koalas experience solastalgia when you take away their forest. They certainly appear to be completely confused. They're now listed by the WWF in the report that came out today as one of the world's critically endangered mammals, and they are. So Earth Emotions is also written for the equivalent of whatever creature it is that you have in your head that's your totem, that's special to you. So I shall leave it at that, and hopefully we have time to quiz you on some of those terms that hopefully you've remembered what they are. If not, you can see my work on a website called Psychoterratica, which is a WordPress blog. Failing that, you can recover from the shock. You've got at least 6 months before the book comes out, and then I challenge you to read it. So that's it.